I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Harmon, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, broadcasting through late night in the Midlands, plus the terrestrial stations in the U.S. with our affiliate in the United Kingdom, as we are syndicated internationally, Deep Program Radio Network, plus their local affiliates in AM and FM. Today, we bring you another double guest 2-hour show. The second hour, joining us back again, is the Infowars World Affairs expert, Joel Skousen, who will be making his appearance at least once a month, as he does for Infowars on a regular basis. But this first hour, I'm very excited to bring somebody who I've wanted to interview for quite some time, but finally we got him on the show. He is an author, an actor, historian, and a criminal trial attorney, plus so much more, and a really down-to-earth cool guy from the time we've had talking before the show. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest, Mr. Jeff Mudgett. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Dr. J, it's a privilege and an honor. I've enjoyed listening to you many times, and I was hoping one day that your team would call me up to give me a shot to come on with you.
Well, we've got you here, and like I said, I'm excited, and this topic is really exciting. And, of course, for you folks out there, you noticed me say that he's a criminal trial attorney. I love talking to JDs because I can understand what they're saying, and they can understand what I'm saying, so we got that in common, too. Now, for those people who haven't heard you on, of course, this show or have paid attention to other places, you've been involved in a lot of things. I mean, like I said, through all the different titles, the book you've written, Bloodstains, 2 different History Channel programs, one of them being an entire series, American Ripper and Haunted History. And of course, you've been featured, and your great-great-grandfathers, who I'm going to talk about in a second or let you talk about, has been featured on TED Talks. That's a pretty serious resume, and obviously you've been making the rounds, which a lot of people care about this case because it is history, and in many cases, it's a little bit of unsolved history. So I guess people would be thinking, well, who is the great-great-grandfather? Why don't you go ahead and tell us, Jeff?
Well, my great-great-grandfather was Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as HH Holmes, who was perhaps America's most evil monster, and monster is the correct word. He was a criminal mastermind serial killer. They even coined the phrase serial killer for him. That's why you'll many times see H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. Well, obviously, he wasn't the first, but he was the first named that. So, and I had gone through much of my life, Dr. J, ignorant of the fact of my ancestry, and not just ancestry, it was my grandfather's grandfather. It was close. So one day when I was about 40 at a dinner party with my family, my grandfather decided to reveal the secret that he had kept to himself his whole life. In fact, keeping it secret from my grandmother, who wouldn't have married him had he told her.
Well, for good reason, I would think, right?
Oh, the newspapers, back in those days, the newspapers, this was the O.J. Simpson trial of the time when Holmes was up for homicide and murder. This was covered by every major newspaper in the land, and they were calling him Satan and the devil. So that's what we were dealing with. And my family basically ran away from the East Coast and came to California to get away from the stigma. So one day, my grandfather decided he'd had enough. He'd carried the burden for too long. He told the family. I was about 40. I had a law practice in San Francisco and a little business in Oakland. And, as you might imagine, he shocked me. Here, all of a sudden, he was explaining that the reason I was there eating dinner that night were the conscious decisions of America's greatest criminal mastermind.
Now, there's also the connection of what was happening in the United Kingdom at the time. And what the allegations, since I've known the H.H. Holmes, and one of the titles that you told me before the air, which was coined for him, by the way, was psychopath, right?
That's right. They manufactured that for H.H. Holmes.
Now, a lot of people, like I was saying, from what I've seen on History Channel, National Geographic, and what I've read, there's another character, Jack the Ripper, in the United Kingdom that people think they finally solved who it was, because that was one of the biggest cases in the United Kingdom in that period. And a lot of it seems to be pointing the figures to your great-great-grandfather. When did people start to talk about H.H. Holmes in fact being Jack the Ripper, or is that just allegation just coming out of, I guess, minds that hope to solve the case?
You know, it wasn't, I had known fellas that came to me. Once they learned I was writing the book about Holmes, I was contacted by two gentlemen in Pennsylvania that had believed Holmes had a connection with the Whitechapel murders for quite a while. And as you know, and as you might expect, I was skeptical at first. I didn't buy into it much. But when my grandfather died, he left me some materials which were Holmes writing to his lawyers, he had many, about him hating London because he couldn't find his favorite newspaper there, the New York Herald, among other things like that. And it was during the proper period of time. So when I was faced with this evidence, you know, of this criminal writing to his lawyer in a privileged fashion, discussing where he was, and then finding out the Philadelphia district attorney actually tried to run down those alibis with Scotland Yard, I said, whoa, we've got to look into this. And I started putting, 2 + 2 together. I went on with George on Coast to Coast, who was a big fan, who believes that Holmes is Jack the Ripper himself. And while I was on Coast to Coast, the TED people were listening, Dr. J, and they invited me to present as if I was a district attorney to a grand jury, the thousands in the audience. And your audience can pull up my TED Talk anytime they want on YouTube. But we pretty much presented the evidence as I had found it, and then allowed the audience to vote what they believed. And as you know, a TED Talk audience is some of the most intelligent people in the world.
Absolutely,
and we came up with a 77% number.
Really? 77% of the TEDx talks believed that there was the link between the two? Because
and it was mostly
that they're very, very intelligent, and to be able to make it to TED Talks and not TEDx Talks, which is the internet version, but TED Talks, that's a thing in of itself. I mean, you're up there with Edward Snowden, dignitaries, people who make a difference. Not very few people actually make it to TED Talks. For you guys out there, guys and gals listening, I need you guys to understand the importance of this being featured on TED Talks and of Jeff being featured on TED Talks. I mean, this is as serious as you can get of a discussion with the appropriate, intelligent people listening. I had to express that, Jeff, because to me, that is probably the absolute biggest thing on your resume, at least in my eyes, of appearances and things you've made.
Oh, I was quite proud of it, and the group that I was speaking with, I felt like I didn't belong. There were some amazing people there that night, and what they allowed me to do, Dr. J, was, as you know, having practiced law, handwriting evidence is something you can pull an expert up that says, yes, that matches, or no, that matches. It happens on every criminal trial in America when there's handwriting involved.
That's right.
But I found an outfit at the University of Buffalo that worked for the CIA and the FBI, even Scotland Yard used them, who had a computer program. And I, after quite a period of time, talked them into running the Dear Boss letter with some of my grandfather's correspondence. And they came back with a 97% number, which has never been refuted by any of the Ripperologists. You know, when you have a theory about Jack the Ripper and you put it to the world, there is probably nothing as volatile in the entire world. I've had death threats. I've had people send me suspicious packages in the mail, as we're seeing in the news today. People get emotional about a theory about who that killer was. And when that number came back, 97%, and then the TED Talk came out, the people at History Channel fell in love with my TED Talk and asked me to host a series, The American Ripper.
And, you said people were sending you packages, making death threats and things of the like. Was it because of what your ancestral relation, or simply because, it's Jack the Ripper, and yet for some reason to this day, he's still feared because he was unknown? The case is still, I guess, opened according to the Scotland Yard. So what was the reasoning, I mean, assuming if they told you any reason why people would act this way?
Well, it maybe has to do with me being an American, Holmes being American, and the UK not having a pride about Ripper, but certainly they put a lot of time and effort into proving those murders, and they haven't been fruitful, and quite frankly, it's been a failure. So when I decided to step in and say, listen, when you go back to those original murders, especially Catherine Eddowes, and you hear the police, when you hear Scotland Yard, when you hear the coroner state, hey, we think this was an American doctor with surgical skills, that's their first comments. And as you know, when you get away from a crime scene and you start producing, your bias and preconceived notions trying to prove a case, you often get error.
Yes.
So yes. So when you go back to those original comments of the ones there on the scenes, there's no surprise that Holmes, who was there in London, could have been the murderer of Catherine Eddowes and wrote the Dear Boss letter. Now, when I was there, I talked to Scotland Yard and their investigators, and they admitted to me that for years, decades even, they believed that there were copycats involved, that not one man killed all five.
One thing that we were mentioning before you came on air, you said already HH Holmes was the surgeon, a doctor here from the United States, University of Michigan, and also was committing insurance fraud. Things that we said right before in there that you were telling me, which are fascinating. I think we should reiterate to the audience that this made it so much easier for him, plus of obviously having the intelligence and the patience to be meticulous to cover up the crimes, because as you mentioned before, we didn't have DNA, we didn't have fingerprints or anything of the forensic categories that CSI is used now to link a crime to suspects.
That's exactly right. I mean, you raise a great point, and I was at a press conference with the anthropologists from the University of Pennsylvania, who are Nobel Prize winners. They're incredible people. And they were talking about, my theory that Holmes could have been Jack the Ripper. And one of the tightest issues that they raised was how history had forgotten how difficult it was, how much skill was needed for a man to commit murder in 3 or 4 minutes' time in a dark street and then remove organs from the cadaver, without damaging other organs that were, bordering the kidneys and the liver. And to hear these anthropologists describe what skill it would have taken to do that, the English coroners are right. It was someone with a surgical skill.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's also true with the Jack the Ripper photos and autopsy and everything else. They said that whoever is doing it has training in the medical field. And that's pretty much the only thing that they were able to figure out based on the books that I had read in the early 80s from the UK investigators from the late 19th century.
No, that's true. And then when I got the chance to work with history on American Ripper, they teamed me up with a lady named Amaryllis Fox as my co-host, who was a trained investigator for the CIA, maybe the smartest human being I've ever met. And, right off the bat, Dr. J, she took me aside and said, I don't believe your theory. I think it's all baloney. And, so it started off basically like that. When we were finished, she said, Jeff, you haven't proven your thesis to me, but you've changed my mind. And I walked away, a very confident man, because during those 8 episodes, I watched Amaryllis go through each piece of evidence we had, and then being backed up by the hundreds of researchers at History Channel. And, this is History Channel. This isn't Sci-Fi Channel. They have a reputation to protect. They had to make sure every piece of evidence checked out and then go on the line to the world with it. And, I don't think there's ever been a theory on who Jack the Ripper was that suffered as much scrutiny as mine has.
And for good reason. You're talking about a case that's, 120 years old, give or take, around that era. And still to this day, there was that Johnny Depp movie. Two things that you were involved in on History Channel, aside from things that I've seen. And this still comes up in popular culture.
There's no doubt about it. And it's when I give my talks around the country, I try to explain to people, listen, I'd like to be the one that proves who Jack the Ripper was. I doubt I will. I doubt anyone ever will. But, let's never forget, while Jack the Ripper is a fascinating cold case, the HH Holmes story here in America is a much, much more bizarre, complex, and diabolical story of a mastermind of crime. And that's the one we should be working on, not Jack the Ripper so much.
Agreed, because Jack the Ripper just stopped. And if it is, in fact, H.H. Holmes, would make perfect sense because he was here at the time. So what's the time frame that he would have come back from the UK and started things out here?
That's a great question, because during the show, Amaryllis and one of the investigators from Chicago went through the passenger list archives for the cruise ship lines that were making the trip back and forth between Southampton and New York. And I knew that if I got involved in that the naysayers would immediately say, no, Mudgett's involved in that. He's got a book he's trying to sell. We're not buying it. So I told the people of the production outfit in History and Amaryllis that I wanted her to do it by herself. And I so much enjoy going back and watching the episode. I think it's like number 5, but of her and the detective finding out the passenger list archives with one of the alias that Holmes loved to use and handwriting that matched. And, those are the things that we kept coming up with over and over on the show that I'm not so sure History has given Amaryllis, History Channel, and my theory enough credit for. So I really want to thank you for letting me come on the show and explaining it to your listening audience.
Oh, absolutely. And as we talked about before, this is just, literally the tip of the iceberg. We're going to definitely go into far more detail next time when I have you for a full 2-hour block. And near the end of your interview, obviously, we'll give the listeners a little tidbit of what's to come then. Now, going back, you just mentioned he was using one of the aliases. What alias did the History Channel detectives find on that log?
Dr. J, he had at least 31. His favorite was H.H. Holmes. I think it was a Johnson this time. I'm not sure. They were all common American names. And, that's one of the great things we did on the show also. History spent a lot of money on American Ripper, and they were wonderful to work with. They hired these 2 renowned English linguists to go through the Dear Boss letter itself, which is probably the most direct piece of evidence in the whole Jack the Ripper case. And, and often considered a journalistic hoax by many. I tend to think it's totally authentic. So when these 2 linguists went through the letter, they came back with a conclusion, which is recorded on the show, that this was written by a highly educated American trying to sound English.
Which it would have fit perfectly what would have been happening in the UK's theater with Jack the Ripper, especially if it's an American-born, American-educated, and a resident of America just visiting the UK, like you said, as opposed to someone living there who wouldn't have any problem trying to sound like the locals.
No, and a man who knew the newspaper, the media well, literature well. This was a man who, while he was committing his crimes in America, Dr. J, he and his team wouldn't send personal letters to each other. They had a code which they would send through advertisements on the major newspapers in America, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Herald. They even used it on the London Times. And, that's the kind of, mastermind we're dealing with here. And one that I find it hard to, when I was working with the scientists at the UPenn when we were trying to identify the remains we exhumed, I kept trying to talk them into believing the chess player we were dealing with, and that he was always 3 or 4 moves ahead. And if they didn't think like him, they weren't going to come up with the proper identification. But quite frankly, I was unsuccessful getting scientists to think like that. I know if I'd have had you there and another lawyer, I could have got lawyers to think like that.
Yeah, that's why one of the things I said at the very beginning is I love talking to other lawyers, because we have a different way of thinking, using that logic and the evidence-based, as a lot of people sort of overlook. Not to undermine other people or other intelligent people in any way, or even detectives. It's just that we were trained to think a certain way for the jobs that we undertook, as opposed to other people, and really nothing but training and actual practice can get us to think that way. And once we start thinking that way, Jeff, you'll agree with this, it sort of applies to all our life, literally.
There's no doubt about it. You and I will tend to look at a crime scene and think of MO immediately, while a scientist will go for the data.
That's right.
And,
that's right.
That's the difference. And I think it's a good difference to have. You just have to know when you need to hire an expert to fit in for that gap.
Agreed. Now, before we talk about the actual arrest, how many alleged murders did he commit? Because the number we'll never really know. That's a given right there. But according to the authorities, what do they think, or at least estimate, or how many bodies were they able to pin on him?
Everywhere I go, there's a debate about how many Holmes actually murdered. Some people will argue 9, some will argue 13, some will argue 27. That's the number he gave in his confession, but the next day he laughed it off to the media while he was in prison. And then you'll have someone like Eric Larson, who wrote The Devil in the White City, one of the great books of our last, the last 2 decades. He brings up the number 200, maybe. I tend to fall back on what you and I were talking about earlier. Is here's a man who was, a physician from one of the great medical schools in America. He was a chemist. He was a pharmacist. Here's a man who, as a teenager, worked with a mortician dissecting bodies. He was perhaps the greatest expert that ever lived at eliminating evidence of murder. So when there's a debate with 3 or 4 people on stage arguing how many people this evil genius killed, I try to tend to stay out of it, because it's like proving a negative. It's impossible.
Yeah, I would see how, and to speculate what is it going to get us? Literally, what is it going to get us? Because that's all we could do is speculate, and the other people will join in, and they're going to give a different number. Just as you said, the ranges of numbers. What I heard growing up was in the 20s, so 27. Again, probably based on what you said is confession, but we all know what you just said is, he laughed it off. Which there you go. What are they going to do at that point? If he wasn't sincere, he wasn't sincere. How many years? Well, yeah, that's a big question. How many years after his final trip back from the United Kingdom after the Jack the Ripper murders was it before he was arrested? I guess I could boil down the question is, what year was he arrested?
Well, I think the actual arrest was 94. The alleged execution was 96, and the Whitechapel murders were 88. So we're dealing with about an 8-year period of time.
How old was he when he was arrested, 1894? Or I guess you could just tell us his birthday, even. We'll just be able to calculate from there. The year.
Yeah, he was born in 1861 in a quaint little town in New Hampshire called Gilmington, which, if any of your listening audience ever gets the chance, make the trip up there. It still looks almost exactly the same as it did when Holmes was a boy. His house is still there. The church that he and his family used is still there. The schoolhouse that Holmes taught elementary school is still there. Now, how about that for a thought to stick in your craw? Here's America's first serial killer teaching elementary school.
I know. Part of me would say that is very surprising, but at this point in age, I can't say I'm too surprised. But I am surprised with him at that era, because even though we don't have the things we said to be able to track down suspects, the rate of murder was far, far lower per per person and percentage-wise as it is now. That's one thing. So for him to be teaching elementary school, I would have thought that the parents of those children, after he was arrested, probably would have flipped out and started questioning their own children what happened.
You know what? I'd never thought of that before, but that'd be an interesting discovery, investigation to take, going back and seeing if any of those family lines have anything regarding when their children were being taught by Holmes.
You also said that your family had to move to California after this ordeal.
Well, when he was on trial in Philadelphia for murder, this was the O.J. Simpson trial of the time. You had the New York Times characterizing him as the Satan of our time. You had the Philadelphia Inquirer calling him the devil. And when the family realized that this stigma was going to be placed on them by a different type of society at the turn of the century, much of them decided to go west, out to California. Obviously, there's no Wi-Fi or social media and Facebook, and they got away from everything and started a new life. So, that's where I grew up. That's where many of the Mudgetts are now. There's still some in New Hampshire and Connecticut, but most of them moved west.
When you said his birthday, 1861, he was really young when he was doing everything. 33 years old when he was arrested. 35 years young when he was executed, and 27 years in 1888. That's a fairly young. And for those out there, put this perspective too, that in that era, anybody could go to college without going to high school. We didn't have school this way you were. I mean, there's a lot of people that if their families could afford it and you were intelligent enough, you could be at Harvard at 16 years old. So I would think part of the reason he had so much available to him in that short period of time is because of his intelligence. And when you talked about him working with a mortician and also being a chemist and a pharmacist on top of a doctor, that just shows the great skill that he would have. And then, of course, it's also seen in the crimes of covering them up. Again, going back to what I was saying, it takes that great deal of patience and intelligence to be able to circumvent what others are looking for. He probably could have pinned this so easily on somebody else if he wanted to.
Oh, I'm sure he did on many of the crimes. And we did, during our investigation, we discovered that Holmes paid for his tuition at the Ann Arbor with selling cadavers. So he and his team would dig up a freshly buried grave at 1 a.m. They would strip the flesh and sell the articulated skeleton to medical schools around the country. And that's how he paid for his college.
And that's what you had to do in that era if you wanted to look, because they really didn't have any ways to preserve a body the way we do. We didn't have refrigerators then, so you had that small window to dissect a body after they died. And it's not like people were selling casts of skeletons. If the medical school needed a skeleton for their school, well, this is how they're going to get one. It's not like it is now where it's regulated and there's other options available. A lot of people need to put that into perspective of the time frame. When I try to think of myself living in that time, you got no electricity unless you're in New York, and you're just barely getting it at that time, those small areas that actually had it. You can't pick up a phone and call somebody. It's not like you're driving your Ford. There's not even Model Ts available. I mean, only the rich have cars at that time. All these little things factor into that life, because to do that, when you compare him to, say, a modern day person, even say that someone who died, Richard Ramirez, I don't know if he's dead or not yet, but the Night Stalker, he could get away in his car, just different things at different times, which I could see why he was labeled what he was, the first serial killer, the first psychopath. Like you said, New York Times even called him Satan. All titles which you don't want to associate with yourself. But for this, obviously what other title to use. Have there been any other titles that have come to you? This is an even other question to add with that. Aside from any other titles that you may know from other newspapers, was there any title that you think didn't fit?
No, and he was a dramatic character at the time too, because you got to remember the Hearst Corporation paid him $7,500 for his memoirs, which he wrote while he was in prison, a dead man walking, awaiting execution. And it's a very dramatic. It's amazing to me that it hasn't been given the acclaim that it deserves, because he was an incredible writer. And the book is very, very entertaining, and you can pick it up anytime. During the show, we went to the Library of Congress, and I got to put my hands on the original.
Really?
But it was fascinating, and some of the the comments that Amaryllis and I went through together are some of the best scenes of the show. But Holmes was a very dramatic fiction writer, which came across in his book, and I highly recommend it for someone wanting to know about murder in America by perhaps the greatest, I hate to use the word greatest, perhaps the most infamous killer that ever lived in our history.
And he really is, going back even further to the Pilgrims coming to this country, or even the formation of the country in the 150 year, almost 200 years later. You really can't put anyone on the map with really until recently, and even then you still have people that have to compare in different ways that you still can't. I'm sure if given the opportunity, if there was a bigger population, those numbers that you mentioned, 13, 27, 9, it would probably be significantly higher. But then that goes back to our original question that we honestly don't know. When you said that the History Channel was skeptics, healthy skeptics in the beginning, did they start to change as they start to see this flow of evidence, like, for instance, the logs of the trips from the U.S. to the U.K.?
There was one scene that probably changed the entire crew. When we were in London, they hired what do they call the lady, the expert that puts from eyewitness testimony, they come up with a drawing of these suspects.
I know what you're talking about. Not the imager. I know what you mean. The person that will actually listen to of someone describe someone and put it out on paper. The name is eluding what they are, but essentially they're drawing a sketch artist. They're sketching what the suspect looks like based on memory. But we can go into a long detail of how flawed that is. But for argument's sake, let's just assume it's not flawed, and of course, using that memory was accurate, that a portrait was sketched.
So we're in the scene, and the whole crew is in the auditorium, and the expert's up on the stage in her made-for-TV office. And there's probably 3 film crews, 2 audio crews. We've got digital viewers back to the United States for History and A&E to be watching while it's in effect. And there was no script, there was no rehearsal. And Amaryllis and I are there watching the back of our heads toward the screen as the lady comes up with her image. And it's next to a picture of Holmes, which she then superimposes over each other. And Dr. J, you could have heard a pin drop in that room, the reaction from the entire crew, who up until that moment was skeptical of my theory. They walked out of that room believing.
From the time you were first contacted to the time of the filming of this episode, how long had it been?
Maybe a year. As you know, creating a television show, you've got to convince a production outfit that it's a marketable, event. They then have to prepare the teasers for them to sell it to a network who has to come up with the cash to fund the entire production, and this one was extremely expensive, back and forth, London and exhumations, those type of things. Most of these shows you see now, you see 2 experts talking at a desk about some piece of evidence that was uncovered 100 years ago. Well, we were uncovering the evidence during the series. And, it was extremely expensive. And so I would say it was at least a year before some in the crew started coming around my way, and especially Amaryllis. That's the one I was most concerned with.
How many episodes was American Ripper?
8.
8. So it was episode 5, or was it episode 6 that they started to come your way?
You know, I'd be guessing. I think the 3, 4, and 5 were in London, but I could be wrong.
Now, which one before we came on air? We're talking about the episode with the corpse, that they were going through the corpse and the bones, trying to identify them.
Well, one of my dreams was to one day exhume the grave where he was allegedly buried after the execution. Because, Dr. J, one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire Holmes story was a piece that the New York Times wrote after the execution called The Holmes Curse. And the New York Times had done an incredible investigatory, reporting, tracking down those that had been involved in his arrest, his incarceration, the trial, and then the alleged execution. And many of those had either died or suffered terrible misfortune and incredibly bad luck. And the New York Times was convinced there was more than just strange coincidence going on here. And when I read those articles, when I started looking closely at how the execution had been carried out, how the burial was the most weird, fantasy-filled event you've ever heard of in your life. I mean, he was buried in a cement sarcophagus. It was very strange, in a two-grave plot with one fake empty coffin next to his body, supposedly. And I started thinking, wait a minute. Anything involving Holmes, when you find coincidence or strange occurrences that he has had his hand on, there is chess being played. So we started looking at the story, and the best way for us to come up with evidence that he'd never been executed and never been buried was to exhume the grave. And as a family member, I was the only one in America who had the power to see that done. We hired a lawyer in Philadelphia, and lo and behold, we convinced the Catholic Church and a judge in Philadelphia to allow us to exhume, and History Channel to record the event.
And there was some debate about the bones, right?
Oh yeah. There, when we exhumed the body, the bones came up. It was a strange scene. I recommend episode 8 to any of your listeners. He still had his hat. He still had boots on. He still had parts of his mustache. His brain was intact in the skull.
Wow.
Which after 120 some years is
miraculous.
I still don't have an answer from the scientists about why that could have happened. So they took the bones back to the University of Pennsylvania because they were under court order. The judge had ordered the UPenn to make the decision on ID, and he told them to use DNA and other forensic testing he gave. So we took the samples in May of 2 years ago, and we waited all summer long for the results to come back, and we sent them to the most renowned DNA testing lab in the world. It's called King's College in London, and their expertise is in ancient DNA. And Holmes's DNA was old enough to be considered ancient in the anthropological world. So we waited and we waited and we waited. And of course, my father and I had already given our DNA to compare with that result when it eventually came up. About late August, the UPenn decided to give up on the DNA, and they made their determination on the teeth, the supposed dental records that existed. Despite my arguing to them over and over again how Holmes had used teeth to defraud insurance companies with fake stiffs and cadavers, and that we had to be very careful with that. We needed to use DNA. We needed to use the skeletal, height. We needed to use anything those anthropologists could come up with that was current, not anything Holmes had his fingers on. So, they decided to identify him based on the teeth, despite the fact that the skeleton was 6 inches shorter than Holmes was reportedly in life.
6 inches shorter and teeth, if he's known to use teeth to defraud insurance. Again, what you were saying, everything he had his hands on is chess. I would really think they would have paid attention to your arguments.
Yeah, I'm still disappointed about that, and I'm arguing with them to this point and with NBC News. We then discovered that the neck vertebra, Dr. J, had no evidence of trauma, despite the man supposedly being dropped through a scaffold to be hung till he was dead.
Again, another piece of evidence that wouldn't fit the execution.
No. And then, so after the final episode, I'm watching TV, and I haven't seen the final episode. And, I have complete trust in History Channel. And I'm watching the episode, and they say DNA matches Jeff Mudgett's, and I went, whoa, wait a minute. So I'm saying I haven't seen any DNA. Where are you getting these results? And the next day, NBC News comes out and says the DNA conclusively matches that of Jeff Mudgett's. And so I call NBC News and I say, guys, where'd you get this? Well, they didn't want to say they got it watching TV. And I said, there's no DNA tests. I haven't seen any results yet. You need to retract that. Well, we're going to put our team of experts on this to investigate this further. 2 months later, they decided to retract it in some little page 5 deal that no one watched. But so basically at this point, Dr. J, we have a skeleton that doesn't match in height. We have a neck that shows no sign of trauma. And we have DNA, which I believe is at best questionable and inconclusive, which you couldn't take it into court and have it used as a piece of evidence in a criminal trial in America. It would be excluded.
It would be, and it's 6 inches shorter. That's right there would have definitely excluded. 6 inches is not, half an inch. You can't really screw that up that is so far attenuated from what he actually is. I'm surprised they even considered this skeleton for identification outside of the purview of doing it for TV. That kind of boggles my mind. Let me ask you this. When you did Haunted History, was this before or after you did American Ripper? Because if it was after, I'm curious if you dealt with any of the same people and if you were ever able to ask them about, hey, wait a second, why are you still pursuing this? Or you did this on TV when you really should be doing that.
No, Haunted History was before. And when you work in TV on cable, Dr. J, you have production companies that sell a show to a network. So they were both different production outfits that I work with. And then they give the end product to History Channel.
Yeah, I should know that from a friend. She produces shows. And as you were going through the steps, just like you were saying, first they have to find the idea, create a sizzle/teaser, then get the funding, and then shoot the pilot. If there's a good reception, then it gets to the audience. So yeah, you're absolutely right that I should have remembered that. It is individual companies. So even though they're under History, those people may do shows for other networks. Very easily they do. A lot of times that's how they survive and thrive. Now, going back, let's put these in perspective of years that each one came out. So you did Haunted History first. What year would have that been?
Oh, I'd say maybe 4 years ago.
And American Ripper?
A year and a half ago.
And TED Talks?
4 years ago. I can check it, but I think
that's okay. This just makes sense that the American Ripper, the longest one, would have been after. Now, I know that Johnny Depp movie came out years before any of these, right?
Yeah, From Hell is what you're talking about, which I enjoyed immensely. I thought Johnny Depp did a great job, and I think that was at least 10 years old.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So you weren't contacted at all for that, were you? Obviously. No. I was, like I said, I was on with George, and the people at TED were listening. And then when I went up on TED, the people at History fell in love with my TED presentation, and it rolled from there. It all spawned from that interview. How long have you said you mentioned when you found this, when did you exactly find out about your connection to HH Holmes from your family?
I was about 40 years old, and I write about it in my book. Bloodstains is not another book about H.H. Holmes. It's more my journey trying to come to grips with having this horrible ancestor and realizing that the idiosyncrasies I'd suffered with my entire life had a cause, had a purpose, had a basis. And, you know, as I try to explain to people when I talk about this, I'd never considered murdering anyone. I don't think I've ever been cited for jaywalking, but I knew that I was different. And when my grandfather explained where we came from, they made sense to me. And, you know, my relationship with my father got better all of a sudden. The arguments, the fights, the emotional tiffs we used to have suddenly had a, you know, they were explainable, that we had these horrible genes in our background, and this man who, while he could have been a Louis Pasteur, decided to be Frankenstein.
At least you were able to confront those, and now to have these open dialogues that you were having with your father. This would, I assume, be a big burden lifted, and a sense also a bonding experience. Since we have 10 minutes, I want to talk more about your book and what's next for you.
You know, the book, like I said, the book is more about me coming to grips with having this thing in my background, and then trying to find out how much of the story was true, how much was legend and lore. Because, you know, in your business, you'll know this. When you deal with something 100 years old, you're using newspaper accounts from reporters who are trying to do the best they can. But, you know, their facts are sometimes questionable. And then when one of their questionable facts is assumed to be true by later authors who put it in their books, all of a sudden now we're in Wikipedia as this is a fact about H.H. Holmes, and over again I found that they weren't true at all. So that was most of the 10 years I put in that work, determining what was fact and what was fiction, and then understanding that there's a huge amount of gaps in the story about Holmes. Now, as far as what I've got going on now, I've got a couple of Hollywood studios interested in making movies. We're working on that now. Nothing's been green lighted yet. But I tell you what, Dr. J, now that I know of your background and your expertise, I'd love to come back on with you the full 2 hours to discuss the Holmes homicide trial, the trial for murder, because it is one of the most complex, most amazing trials in the history of American jurisprudence. And it's covered extensively by the district attorney, by the trial judge, by the appeals court, who decided they had to go over the whole trial again to see if a mistrial should have been ordered. And the arguments about whether circumstantial evidence can amount to beyond a reasonable doubt, whether one of Holmes's wives can be called to the stand to testify against him because he's a bigamist. It goes on and on and on, and I'd love to put the whole 2 hours in with you discussing each individual issue. And what I do is I'll send you a copy of that transcript, and it will have a great show, I got to guarantee you.
Oh, we absolutely will. When you first mentioned this before, and I told you I definitely want to have you back for 2 hours, the fact that we both have that background and we could both go through it and explain to the listeners, you know, things that me and you might be able to pull of why certain things were said, why certain questions were asked, because we understand the rules of evidence and different things like that. And the fact that, we might as well say this to people, the fact that he represented himself was one of the key things, right?
He represented himself through much of the trial. The judge would get irritated periodically about his lack of, you know, documentation and the statute. So he'd demand that he sit down and his lawyer stand up to do that. But at one point, the judge describes Holmes' summation as the smoothest, silkiest gathering of words he'd ever heard of in 30 years on the bench. And you're going to be amazed at how this trial ends up, how the appeals court decides that while they don't agree that Holmes was proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was too evil of a man to let go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually seeing the transcripts of what the judge called him, or each time there was an objection from the other side, or each time if the court reporter, if the judge was actually saying something that was making him irritated or commenting. I just think all of that in the context would be great. And like you said, if this was the OJ trial of then, this is a better way to put it. This was the original trial of the century, because this was the trial of the 19th century. And before that, in the U.S. history, there really is no trial like this. So you could really say this was the first major trial of the century, which ended up being adopted for OJ.
No, exactly. And I mean, you've got every reporter in the country from every major newspaper there in the audience. You've got two of Holmes's wives there, despite the fact that one of them's on the stand calling state's evidence to testify against him, and then him asking her about love and how could she be doing this, and then trying to get the jury to explain that he was an emotional man with tears running down his face. I mean, it's I got to tell you, would be the greatest courtroom drama major motion picture ever made.
Have you ever, I know you said you got some networks and some production companies talking to you to make a film. Would they ever consider, have you brought this up, to actually make just something on the actual trial, even if it was a 1 to 2 hour documentary on History Channel with someone with actors involved, and then if they switched to experts in between, or if they just made a literal feature film on this, if it wasn't even for theatrical release, even a made for TV, would be really interesting to see it. And if they use nothing but the transcripts, that would be that much better. Having actors literally use nothing but what was recorded at the time. That's a hell of an idea. Have you ever pitched it to anybody?
Oh, yeah, but I put the stop on these made-for-TV stuff. I want it to be a major motion picture. I want a major star to play Holmes. I'll wait, and it's something that deserves more than that. And when you the thing about courtroom dramas, some of the great ones like A Few Good Men or the Caine Mutiny, with the actual transcripts, like you mentioned, it's a can't miss. It's a cheap production to make. And, I'll have a studio come up. But right now what's holding us back, Dr. J, is, Leonardo DiCaprio bought the rights to The Devil in the White City from Tom Cruise. And he hired Martin Scorsese to direct the movie, and Paramount's going to fund it and, produce it. But right now they're in a stalemate for some reason, and I don't know why. And so the rest of Hollywood's a little reluctant to jump into it until those giants decide what they're going to do.
I still think that people will do it. Like you said, if you're waiting for the right time, I know this is something that they're not going to dismiss, because HH Holmes is a part of history, and it's always come up in my lifetime. And I know for a fact it's always going to be coming up. So that's one thing that, just like Jack the Ripper for UK, and of course even here in the United States, will never go away. The idea of him, even if they do say they solve it at some point, or if conclusively, if it comes back that your great-great-grandfather was in fact Jack the Ripper, it's still going to always be talked about. And that's why I feel the same thing with H.H. Holmes. Another thing I wanted to go back to real quick is when you talked about in the American Ripper at the end, the episode that you actually saw on TV but didn't know what they were going to do until then. Are you going to pursue the DNA option again, especially since NBC said the wrong thing, essentially in some way defaming you, but because you were a public figure from being an actor, hopefully there wasn't any harm?
No. When the judge allowed us to exhume, he demanded that we all agreed not to make a public spectacle of the event, that he was going to, give us permission to do this. And we had helicopters flying over the grave, the exhumation, everything. But he ordered the body put back and the way that it was dug up. So the anthropologists at UPenn and the teams that history hired to do the digging, they put him back properly. And there is no way in hell, Dr. J, that judge would allow us to dig him up again to get more samples.
Well, this kind of shoots my other question in the foot. They're obviously studying certain brains. I know Stalin's brain, Einstein's brain are being preserved and studied. If they put it back, there's no way, because if you said it was as preserved as it was, which is definitely a rare thing considering the age, I would have thought they might have wanted to consider looking into the first serial killer in America and the first person to have that title. What made him so different? I clearly would have think science would have jumped on this, but I guess is it out of respect? Is this why they put it back, or was it even talked about to study his brain?
Oh yeah, my father and I agreed to donate the brain to the University of Pennsylvania if they could preserve it, so that 40 years from now, when technology existed to actually, determine what was inside his brain that made him so different, maybe we came up with something that prevented future murders. My dad and I both said, you guys take it. Go to the judge and say that we're agreeing to do this. And the UPenn declined. They didn't want to do it.
That just makes it sad. Like you said, it could have prevented a lot more murders if that's what they were able to identify, or it could have been able to understand them in some way. Again, without the brain, we could only speculate as to what extensive research they could have done and what they would be able to figure out. It's just a sad thing that they didn't want to pursue it. Now, we are coming near the end of the interview. And by all means, we definitely will have a full 2-hour show. I would love to go through the transcripts on air, and I definitely will read them off air. Let's plug in, obviously, your book, again, Bloodstains. Where can people buy it? Amazon, anywhere else you want? Any websites you have to plug in? Want to talk about?
Yeah, you can go, for Kindle, you can go to Amazon. But if you go to www.bloodstainsthebook.com, I sell my book there, and if they'd like a signed copy, your listeners are welcome to one. Just ask my manager for one, and we'll see what we can do. And then, I'm working with a couple outfits now on another television series. It hasn't been green lighted yet, but it sounds incredible. I wish I could tell you more about it, but they have my lips sealed.
Yeah, and NDA, non-disclosures.
Yeah. Oh, God, you know what? Let's do a show one day on how much I hate NDAs, okay?
Fair enough. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then I've got
too.
Yeah, and then I've got a show on a travel channel, a series that's been on for 5 or 6 years. I'm sure you can guess which one it is. But they want to do a special about Holmes, and they've asked me to help. So, there's the interest in Holmes grows. The story continues to blossom. It never seems to stop. And the more you dig in, the more amazed you are. It's like just the other day, me finding out that the district attorney in Philadelphia had actually asked Scotland Yard for help in deciphering Holmes's code. And, it never stops.
Another link. There's another link right there. Again, this is all stuff we'll go into in a full 2-hour show, which I already know is going to be great, and I'm going to have you back on after that. Real quick, before we go to break for the second guest, if you have any final statements for anybody, we did plug it. And again, TED Talks, everybody want to see Jeff on TED Talks. Just search Jeff Mudgett and TED Talks. And, of course, American Ripper, they still play that, don't they, here and there on History Channel?
No, you got to subscribe to their .com, and then you can pull up each episode. They don't rerun it on television, and quite frankly, I don't know why.
Probably money. That's how the subscriptions work. Anyhow, Jeff, it's been fantastic to have you. I look forward to bringing you back again and going through the transcripts. Everybody stay tuned. We come back from break. We're going to have the Infowars World Affairs expert Joel Skousen. Until then, everybody enjoy the break music real quick and the promos in there. And don't forget about the Spookathon Friday till Sunday, 70 hours straight, and possibly more hours coming. Again, Jeff, I want to thank you for your time. Unfortunately, I won't be able to thank you off air because of the fact that we got back-to-back guests, and I will call you soon to do this other 2-hour show. So thanks again, Jeff.
I've had a blast. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be right